This is the beginning of tape 2 of the segment 10-1A for the training program on the IBM Selectric typewriter. We concluded the last tape by saying that whenever we install a motor, we must try to position the motor so as to obtain maximum belt tension with minimum idling noise. But equally as important is the fact that the motor belt must track in the center of the two pulleys, the motor pulley and the hub pulley, because without it, the belt will soon become frayed at the edges and eventually need premature replacement. Slide number 64. On motors having the clamp down brackets, use a screwdriver in the manner shown and remove the motor brackets. Stop your player if you need more time. Slide number 65. Once the clamps are off, the motor can easily be removed from its support bracket. If the motor of your machine was mounted in a manner such as in this case, now is the best time to remove the indicated ground wire. On machines which have the on-off switch under the keyboard, it becomes necessary to separate the motor from the machine, leaving the switch behind. In that case, we disconnect the motor wires by either unscrewing the wire nuts or by disconnecting the wires from the switch directly at the switch. Notice that this motor does not come equipped with a capacitor or any other kind of electrical component which could help it establish the direction of turning. This is our physical indication that we're dealing with a shaded pole motor. Slide number 66. As mentioned, some machines have their on-off switch at the front, mounted at the bottom right of the keyboard. In this particular case, it comes installed at the rear of the machine, and it is possible to lift it out of the machine together with the motor. If your machine has this kind of a switch arrangement, make sure that you do not force or break the indicated fork on the toggle arm when you remove your switch. At this point, you should complete the removal of the motor, the power cord, the on-off switch, as well as the ground wire from your typewriter. Slide number 67. This represents the typical wiring diagram for the insulated shaded pole motor. With the exception of the ground wire, which is colored green and yellow, or simply green, we can reconnect the shaded pole motor directly to our wall outlet without concerning ourselves about the way in which we connect the motor wires. The shaded pole motor will always start to rotate in the correct direction, regardless of the position of the wires. And this, of course, makes it extremely easy to reconnect the motor wires. The ground wire is connected directly to the power frame or the chassis of the typewriter. Slide number 68. Shaded pole motors can be constructed to rotate either clockwise or counterclockwise by properly placing the shaded pole coils. Shaded pole motors are single-phase motors which contain divided stator poles. The coils of the shaded poles develop an axis which differs from the axis of the main poles. The voltage in the shaded poles is induced by the flux in the main part of the poles. Thus the two fields are also out of phase. The distinct axis and the out-of-phase fields interact to produce a distorted overall field that rotates. Thus it is possible to have an AC motor which knows its direction of rotation without the use of a capacitor. These motors become quite hot when in operation, and it is important to use caution when working with them. Slide number 69. Let us now examine the motor clutch for a moment. The motor clutch is designed to allow time for the motor to build up speed when it is first turned on. Shaded pole motors have a very low starting torque. It is important not to load them down with anything until they have developed the proper torque. For this, we use the motor clutch. Notice the motor clutch pawls and the weights attached to them. The RPM of the motor must first reach a minimum level before the weights attached to the end of the pawls will tend to swing out against the action of the springs connected to the end of the pawls. As a result of this, one of the heels of the pawls will engage with one of the teeth on the motor pulley. Yellow pencil. Notice that only one pawl can engage with the motor pulley at one time. The other pawl just rides along. It is most important that the pawl heels be in good shape, showing no signs of wear. Occasional slippage or jumping from one tooth to the next will primarily cause impression problems. Slide number 70. Using these special pliers for pressure rings, remove the ring or retainer from the end of the motor shaft, as shown. Be careful not to open the retainer any more than necessary. A pressure ring can easily be broken with these pliers. Slide number 71. Once the pressure ring or retainer has been removed, it is easy to take out the motor pulley and find the plastic bushing between the motor shaft and the motor pulley. We are talking about the item in the center with the holes in it. It is very important that the motor be allowed to rotate independently from the motor pulley at the time when the motor is turned on. Such a condition is needed in order to allow the motor time to develop the torque needed to drive any of the typewriter mechanisms which might have been tripped while the machine was not plugged in. The motor will simply stall if the initial load is too large for it. Slide number 72. When the motor is at rest, the spring indicated by the yellow pencil causes the motor clutch pawl to rest against the lug pointed at by the red pencil. By forming this lug in or out, it is possible to adjust the clearance between the heel of the pawl and the tooth of the motor pulley. This clearance should be kept between 1/4 to 1/2 of 1 millimeter. The springs on the motor clutch must have exactly the correct amount of tension and length in order to allow for proper motor clutch operation. If they are too strong, the rated RPM of the motor will not be sufficient to cause the engagement between the motor clutch pawls and the motor pulley. This can cause premature wear on the heels of the clutch pawls. If the springs are too weak, the RPM of the motor never quite has a chance to build up sufficiently before the clutch pawls already engage with the motor pulley, thus defeating the very purpose of the clutch. It is therefore advisable to replace the whole clutch pawl assembly whenever there is a need to repair the motor clutch. Slide number 73. The clutch hub is adjustable sideways on the motor shaft by loosening the set screw. This hub is adjusted in conjunction with the adjustment of the position of the motor. When reinstalling the motor must be positioned front to rear so as to establish maximum belt tension, but without causing the drive mechanism to become noisy. Second, the motor position is adjusted angularly so that the belt runs or tracks on the center of the motor pulley. Third and finally, this motor clutch hub and the pulley are adjusted sideways to allow the belt to track or run in the center of the large hub pulley. Because of the fact that different motor belts do not always track in the same manner, it may become necessary to refine one or more of these adjustments after the sequence has been completed. For example, the angular position of the motor may need such a substantial correction that in carrying out the correction, you develop slack in the motor belt. You might consider returning to the beginning of this explanation for slide number 73 in order to review or even jot down the sequence which we just gave. Slide number 74. At this point, let us reassemble the motor clutch. Before reinstalling the plastic shim and the pulley, we should lubricate the shaft by applying a film of oil on it. Also, check the motor bearings to make sure that they are properly lubricated. When we reinstall the pressure retainer ring, we must be sure to allow some end play for the motor pulley, as shown here. After you have completed the reassembly of the motor clutch, please leave the assembled motor out of the typewriter. As mentioned before, whenever the motor is reinstalled, it must be installed so as to offer maximum tension for the motor belt, but without causing any noise.